Okay, those that don't have a copy of the syllabus and the quick reference, if you click the crystal, it should give you one. If not, then I have to beat it more. It should. If it's not, then it means I have to fix it. Okay, then I will do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, hopefully this time they went through. You're welcome. So much for fancy teacher tools. Okay, well, these workshops start off with a reading from Seeds from a Birch Tree by Clark Strand, and then we have time afterwards to discuss and to practice writing haiku. The first reading for today is going to be Mountain Laurel. The mountain laurel hasn't turned, but every leaf is notched or bitten. And that was written by Carl Sherman. This haiku was written at a workshop in the Catskill Mountains. That weekend, the weather had become increasingly cold. The leaves were past their color, and only acorns were still falling from the trees. Once we reached our destination, I gave a talk about composing from nature. Few of the participants had written haiku before, so I kept it brief, telling them only to look carefully and find whatever they could. The group fanned out over the mountainside, and I walked from person to person, answering questions until it seemed that everyone had the proper feel. I had hiked Mount Tremper before, so I went somewhat farther than the others. I remember noticing how the coolness crept further inside my sweater as I climbed. Finally, I came over the top of a ridge and saw a solid wall of green before me, about 50 yards distant. It was disorienting. Then, after a moment, I realized it must be mountain laurel. When I crossed back over the ridge, I met up with a member of the group. He seemed comfortable walking alone, so I suggested that he try going further north and pointed in that direction. Later, I was pleased to see the haiku he had written, but I wasn't surprised. There had been a haiku there already, waiting for someone to come. So again, he stresses about how there's haiku everywhere if we just look for it and get into the haiku mindset. The next section is the Haiku Diary. From my own experience, I have found it helpful to keep a moderately messy notebook, one in which I can feel free to scribble notes at random moments of the day. If you regularly carry a backpack or a shoulder bag, this may be of standard size, otherwise somewhat smaller. The notebook should be neither cumbersome nor tiny. Use a blank book that does not have the dates already printed in it. You will not know beforehand how much or how little you will write on a given day, if at all. The correct way to use the haiku diary is just to be very free and open. Don't set a single format. Don't organize the book 5 haiku to a page or limit it to poems and dates, excluding prose. You may even find that you jot down an occasional phone number or appointment in its pages when no other book is handy, or, if you are an artist, a sketch of some interesting scene. Write down your haiku just as they come to mind, without too much deliberation over whether they are good or bad. Improvement takes place slowly, so set them down the way they come, and stay alert for the next opportunity to write. When I describe the haiku diary in this way, people sometimes get the mistaken impression that they ought to relax or even ignore the rules of haiku. This is not the case. If one wants to use poetry as a spiritual practice, first one has to be a poet, otherwise it is all a sham. The important thing to remember in keeping a haiku diary is this. Each time you write, make an honest effort to compose a poem in the proper form. Make this effort every time, whether you are successful or not. Basho once said that anyone who had written 5 haiku during his or her lifetime was a poet, whereas the person who wrote 10 or 15 was a master. Some poets interpret this to mean that Basho set his standards very high. I think his real intention was to defeat the acquisitional attitude of mind that afflicts so many poets. For 17 years I kept a notebook in which I recorded my best poems from each haiku diary. Every few months I would transfer them into the book and throw the diary away. Then one day I came home from a walk having written my first real haiku. So that night I took my precious notebook out on the back porch and burned it, without even looking at any of the poems. I simply knew that no amount or ingenuity or craft alone can make a haiku. We move to where haiku come from. To begin with, I think we could say that haiku come from real events, but that is not entirely right, because the event itself will not make a poem, much less a haiku. The Japanese author Yagi Kamitaro wrote, "To the single image, the poet's mind must add a turn of thought. The poet's mind is crucial." In other words, the poet cannot be merely passive. For all its realism and objectivity, a haiku is not a photograph, but a poem. Ultimately, where haiku come from is a mystery. Some haiku result from imagination. Some idea or feeling catches our interest, and we begin to imagine a phrase or image to match it with. This method of composition rarely results in a great haiku, but even when the result is acceptable, we are still left saying that the poem came out of imagination, which is to say, it's rather mysterious after all. Once we begin to speak of haiku as a spiritual practice, where haiku come from becomes at least a more familiar mystery. Engaged in some activity, walking for instance, or working in the garden, at a certain point a haiku just comes right out of that activity as its natural expression. It may be something we have seen or heard, a momentary reflection, or a phrase that slips right out in conversation. One day last summer I took a walk along Buzzards Bay with my father-in-law, Matt Finn. At one point he stopped beside a tidal pool and made the remark, "When the tide goes out all the minnows leave the pool." Then a moment later he added, "I've been looking at that all my life." On the way back to the house we passed the pool again, and it was just as he had said. The minnows were all gone. A moment after that I realized that Matt had composed the first 2 lines of a haiku, so I added a third from what struck me about the scene. When the tide goes out, all the minnows leave the pool. It's cloudy weather. So, one way of looking at it is to say that we go to a particular place and write the poetry out of that place. We simply describe in 17 syllables what we have seen, what struck us or moved our hearts. So, although it is still a mystery, when someone asks where a particular haiku came from, we can at least offer a particular place and time. Okay, we have a couple more sections. The salamander. On a creek bed rock, a salamander resting its tail in the water. And that was by Emmy Stanley. A very fresh haiku, slightly cool, the kind of feeling one gets from holding up a finger to test the wind. The poem has an interesting history, which the poet shared with me a few months after the workshop where it was written. According to Emmy, she had looked in vain for a haiku that day. Finally, when she had almost given up, she recalled a nearby place some children had shown her a few months before. The children had said, "You want to see someplace secret?" And Emmy said yes. They led her to the far end of the tunnel, where a stream came out after running underneath the road. Several months later, Emmy thought that she might have better luck finding a haiku in the place where the children had led her. So she went there and sat down on a rock looking at the stream, and waited. After a few minutes, a small red salamander came to rest before her on a stone. After she told me this story, I had felt a much deeper, if simpler, understanding of something Basho had once said. When asked the meaning of lightness, he replied, "Just observe what children do." With that in mind, we move to the group. Like any spiritual practice, haiku is something that happens in a group. However, if that group becomes a thing in itself, then its spiritual aspect will be lost. So in haiku, we keep things small. Most haiku groups are composed of 6 to 10 people who meet once a month to share their poems. At such meetings, each poet submits anonymously 3 or 4 haiku on a separate index card. These poems are shuffled and read aloud, and each poet chooses the 5 haiku he or she likes the best and explains why. The poem that receives the most votes is declared the winner, which simply means it is the kind of haiku that the group prefers. Haiku is unique in the world of poetry, and there is no mystery as to why haiku has evolved as a kind of group art. Unlike longer poems, a haiku can be grasped all at once. In fact, haiku could almost be defined that way. When we read a haiku through to the end, and then touch back briefly on the beginning to get the moment whole, an image forms in the mind. The effect of that image is to show us what the poet saw, what inspired him to compose a poem, and that evokes a smile. Thus, haiku is all about sharing. Everyone in the group is a poet, everyone is a reader of poems. What we share in haiku is a feeling for the season, for the longness or shortness of the day, the angle of the sunlight coming through the trees, the shape and altitude of the clouds. All the things which change with the season, coming into being and vanishing before our eyes. As haiku poets, we observe and appreciate these things together as a group. Sharing those experiences deepens them and deepens our relationships to one another. The result is that we become more present, more profoundly connected to where we are. The members of a haiku group, therefore, are all people who live close to one another. Although they may sometimes submit poems for publication at the regional or national level, the focus of all their activity is local. In my experience, this is what makes for the deepest and most lasting spiritual life. In SL, I'm going to say that isn't completely true, though, because local in SL kind of tends to focus around groups, since everybody can be in different sims and then still feel local while talking in the group chats. But that's my personal comment there. Okay, and the last reading for the day is A Gift. When I first began seriously writing haiku, I was a member of a group. Not a haiku group, but a ragtag group of college students with an interest in Zen. We held zazen meetings every morning in the drafty little house we rented from our studio art professor, shared meals together, and read the same books. There were 3 of us to begin with, Stephen, Michael, and myself. Later, Steve's girlfriend Lucy moved in. It all started like this. I had begun meditating in the fall of 1977 when I left school abruptly at mid-semester to travel to International Daibatsu Zendo, a traditional Japanese-style Zen monastery that had opened in the Catskills the year before. There I was offered the briefest instruction I had ever received. "Sit," was all the abbot said, and lowered his eyes to a spot before him on the floor. That was it. I went back to my parents' home in Atlanta and worked for a year as a construction worker, trying all the while to understand what it meant. "Sit," the abbot had said. I did that every morning and every evening. The first few weeks I often cried from the pain of sitting motionless on the floor, or from the strain of trying to wrap my mind around that single word. Eventually, I returned to the monastery for further instruction. Again, it wasn't much, and the following year I returned to school in Tennessee. My friends were curious about what I had been doing, and so I explained as best I could. One night, my friend Michael approached me in the dining hall carrying a large package. I was waiting in line. "This is for you," he said, and thrust the package into my hands. I unwrapped the brown paper while several people looked on, and there emerged a plump black meditation cushion exactly like the ones they used in the monastery. "I made it myself," he declared, and before I could say anything, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. I don't know what struck me more, the abruptness of the gift or the fact that Michael had sewn it himself. I didn't know whether any of my friends could sew. I couldn't, and I would have been willing to bet that Michael couldn't either. But when I examined the cushion, with its elaborate pleated sides, the job was well done. I later learned that Michael could make virtually anything from a set of instructions found in a book, including tofu. In fact, he had taught himself to meditate that way. That night, I went back to my room and used the cushion for the first time. Everything was different. It wasn't the fact of the cushion per se, which I could have purchased from the monastery, but the fact that Michael had made it for me. It completely changed the way I thought of him and the way I thought of myself. After that night, the two of us stood in relationship to something else. Suddenly, what I was doing seemed less foreign, less like something I had studied at a monastery in upstate New York, and more like something I could practice where I lived. In the years since then, I have often thought about our Sewanee Zendo. Steve and Lucy got married. Michael lives in Berkeley. And all of us have gone on to do something further with Zen. But when we go to one another now, there is something more than nostalgia. And I sometimes make a kind of joke about International Daibosatsu Zendo, the monastery in the Catskills where I later trained and lived, because, after all, a spiritual practice doesn't happen internationally. It happens where you live. And that is the end of the readings for the day. So, any observations, or do we want to jump into trying our hand at the 5-7-5 syllable format of haiku? Yes, sometimes I have trouble waiting too. Alright, well then, let's get to it. It is my birthday, but all the cakes are missing. Die, Celestia. I love that one, Nix. That's awesome. Nah, you're not obsessed. I think I might have an extra syllable in here, but I can't find it. I'm not sure. Just for some reason, I'm not finding where it's off. Ah! You're right. Yeah, I have to count them on my fingers sometimes, too. Or with sticks, with marks on paper. Maybe I should try counting with cupcakes. Ooh, I like that one, Phoenix. Agreed. Yes, you're a puppy. Yes, you're a giant puppy, and I don't have much of a lap for you, dog. Hello, Teddy. You missed the reading part. We're now working on practicing haikus. Okay, now I can hear people. What did I miss? I can hear you. Relogging scattered my brain all over just a moment. Pumpkins. Write me a haiku about pumpkins. Gourding the night. I like that. Well, we want to hear yours too, because you know you're the pumpkin king and all that. The great pumpkin. That's a nice one too. Now I need to write. I'm muttering to myself as I think. Don't mind me. Alarm clocks are evil. I don't blame you for not wanting his alarm clock. Oh, that's terrible. It's okay. I can just jump on you, bounce you out of bed, then run away before you can catch me. Well, then I'll have to make sure I put couch cushions along beside the bed before I bounce you out. If you land on the cat, then it's the cat's fault for being there. Ooh. Yes, it could. I like that one because it's got so many different images all at once. Aww. That is cute. Oh, I'm saving them all. It's going to be in the records. It's okay. And that's good. Oh, yes. She still teases me about that, too.
Hey, Mom.
What's up, Merlin?
Kid upstairs has been on Xbox 360.
See if Gabe is awake, because it's his Xbox. He needs to be the one to say yay or nay, okay?
He's sleepy.
He's still taking his nap?
I'm gonna talk.
It's 7 o'clock, so why don't you go ahead and try to wake him up from his nap so he'll sleep tonight, okay?
What a goof.
Oh, yes.
Hey, Mom.
What, buddy?
But if you waking up.
Do you want me to wake him up? He's not waking up for you?
Yep.
Okay, let me finish this haiku before it goes away, and then I will go and wake him up.
I'll take it over for you. You will wake him up. You wake him up. No, you don't say yes. Stop. Stop. Stop.
He would certainly try. Excuse you, young man. Thank you. So it wasn't about pajamas, it ended up about the alarm clock, but still. They're connected.